can a masterful lens, a dazzling image, and stirring music rewrite history and distort consciousness so that beauty itself becomes a form of deception? In 2008, a film was released that was unique in appearance and profound in essence. It blended documentary investigation, animation, and dramatic storytelling into a seemingly humanistic and contemplative narrative that, beneath the surface, concealed a cunning attempt to reconstruct memory from a deeply elusive perspective. The film is Waltz with Bashir, directed by Ari Folman. It tells the story of a former Israeli soldier suffering from partial memory loss as a result of his participation in the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Driven by the need to recover his lost memories, he embarks on a journey to rediscover what truly happened during that time, particularly the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, committed by Lebanese militias allied with Israel in West Beirut, under the protection of the Israeli army. Though the film appears documentary in form, its narrative unfolds as a psychological odyssey through the horrors of war, rather than as a political or judicial indictment of the army that enabled and oversaw the massacre. Thus, despite its undeniable artistic value, the film becomes a subtle instrument of Zionist propaganda, masterfully employing emotional camouflage. Unsurprisingly, it captivated Western audiences, earning the prestigious Golden Globe for Best Foreign Language Film and receiving an Academy Award nomination in 2009. Many Arab critics, however, perceived it as a soft absolution of the Israeli conscience, a calculated attempt to drain the crime of its political meaning. In this sense, the film stands as a crucial example for studying Israeli cinema as an ideological discourse that seeks to reshape historical memory of the region's wars, transforming the perpetrator into a tormented witness and replacing moral responsibility with sentimental humanism. The film opens with a dense symbolic scene depicting a pack of dogs racing through the streets of Tel Aviv at night, as if chasing a ghost, or perhaps one man in particular, ignoring everyone else in their path. The question that arises in the viewer's mind from the very first moments is, what is the significance of these dogs? And why are they pursuing a specific man? This opening scene, depicting a dream, confronts the audience with the film's central dilemma, the lost memory of a former Israeli soldier whose mission during raids on villages and refugee camps was to kill guard dogs, lest their barking awaken the residents. A simple scene, yet it becomes the narrative engine of the entire film, presenting the soldier as a man in search of a forgotten truth buried in his military past. After meeting an old friend, he is surprised to learn that this friend, too, recalls nothing of his own participation in the Israeli invasion of Lebanon or the Sabra and Shatila massacre. Thus begins a journey through the memories of his fellow soldiers as he attempts to piece together the fragmented recollections of war. Throughout this quest, he encounters about 9 individuals whose testimonies intersect to form a fragmented mosaic of memories, nightmares, and hallucinations, where reality and imagination blur, and images transform into recurring dreams that reflect the soldier's psychological trauma through a fusion of mental recollection and visual symbolism. Although this technique appears to serve a purely artistic purpose, it subtly advances an ideological goal. It separates military action from moral responsibility by portraying the massacre as an unintentional collective nightmare rather than a deliberate crime orchestrated under military authority. Thus, the film becomes a journey through the mind of a traumatized Israeli soldier, not an honest portrayal of the suffering endured by Lebanese and Palestinian victims. This intent is made evident through 2 key symbols. The first is the scene where the Israeli soldier dances amid bullets on the streets of Beirut to the rhythm of a waltz, a haunting contrast between terror and melody. The second lies in the name Bashir, an unmistakable reference to Bashir Gemayel, the leader of the Lebanese Kataib Party, Israel's ally, who was elected president but assassinated in 1982 before assuming office, an event that triggered the Sabra and Shatila massacre as a retaliatory act. In this sense, Waltz with Bashir becomes not merely a fleeting dance, but a blood-soaked alliance wrapped in the elegance of artistic rhythm. To grasp the full context, one must return to the historical event itself, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. On the 6th of June 1982, Israel launched a military operation under the symbolic name Operation Peace for Galilee, allegedly in response to an assassination attempt on its ambassador in London. In reality, however, the true objective was to dismantle the military infrastructure of the Palestine Liberation Organization, expel it from Lebanon, and install a pro-Israeli government under Bashir Gemayel, the Maronite leader of the Kitab Party. The invasion began with Israeli ground forces advancing northward from the southern border towards Sidon and Tyre, eventually reaching West Beirut, the headquarters of the PLO. By early September, the Lebanese capital had fallen under a full siege that lasted more than 8 weeks. During this time, residential neighborhoods were relentlessly bombarded, resulting in the deaths of over 18,000 Lebanese and Palestinian civilians, according to reports by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Amid this turmoil, Bashir Gemayel emerged as a presidential candidate with direct support from Tel Aviv and was elected president of Lebanon on the 23rd of August, 1982. His assassination 3 weeks later, however, provided the militias loyal to him with a pretext for revenge against Palestinians and Lebanese in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, an atrocity carried out under the supervision and protection of the Israeli army, which encircled the camps and prevented civilians from escaping. The massacre continued for more than 72 hours, claiming the lives of approximately 3,500 civilians, most of them women and children. Incidentally, we have covered this topic in detail in our documentary Years of Blood, the Lebanese Civil War, which you can watch via the link in the description and pinned comment. Following the Israeli invasion of southern Lebanon and throughout the ensuing decades, the Israeli establishment sought to reframe the invasion as a defensive war that culminated in a psychological catastrophe for its soldiers. This narrative became particularly evident in Israeli cultural and cinematic production during the first decade of the 21st century, as a wave of films began depicting the war through the lens of the soldiers' trauma rather than the suffering of the victims. Thus, the film should not be mistaken for an act of confession, as it might appear to the ordinary viewer. Rather, it is an artistic stratagem, a means of taming guilt by transforming it into a trauma that invites international sympathy. In truth, it represents the narrative of a nation seeking psychological redemption for its crimes, portraying war as a therapeutic journey for the Israeli conscience. From the very first scene, it becomes clear that memory is not merely a narrative device but the central axis of the director's artistic vision. Yet he does not employ it as a means to recover truth, but as an instrument to reshape that truth through a psychological lens serving the notion of the victimized perpetrator. The Israeli soldier's amnesia, in psychoanalytic terms, symbolizes Israel's selective memory, one that erases whatever contradicts its political narrative. This is underscored poignantly in one of the film's dialogues through a fundamental question. Can the mind choose to forget what it cannot bear to remember? Thus, amnesia in Israeli cinematic discourse has been employed as a political tool to evade responsibility, portraying soldiers not as active participants in a documented historical atrocity, but as victims of a collective psychological trauma. In this sense, selective memory becomes a form of narrative purification that reconstructs Israel's image before the West as a nation that grieves and suffers, rather than one that is accountable and condemnable. The director employs a visual technique that oscillates between reality and dream, blending scenes of war with surreal imagery, such as mermaid-like visions or the golden light enveloping Beirut in the moments preceding the massacre. This visual aesthetic imbues the catastrophe with poetic beauty while simultaneously diluting its documentary depth, transforming the event from a tragedy into an existential experience. Here, war is not told as a colonial crime, but as a spiritual crisis endured by an Israeli soldier who has witnessed more than his soul can bear. The brilliance of the animation cannot be overlooked. It combines golden shadows with deep nocturnal blues, rendering scenes of war as hauntingly beautiful tableaus where violence becomes contemplative art. Blood is unseen, bodies are reduced to abstract symbols, while the soldiers' emotions occupy the center of the frame. Through this polished aesthetic, brutality is replaced with sorrow, massacre with nightmares, and the image shifts from documentation to beautification of the inhumane act. Yet, what surpasses all of this is the film's subtle insistence on a notion of shared humanity, reducing political conflict to generalized feelings of fear, grief, and remorse, without any mention of occupation or aggression. It becomes, in effect, an erasure of the moral distinction between killer and victim, between a powerful army wielding planes and tanks, and a defenseless population trapped in besieged camps. This false equivalence functions as a potent propaganda device, fostering the illusion that all are victims, and therefore none are guilty. The film, then, does not exonerate Israel through documents, but through emotion, using spectacle and framing to etch a carefully constructed mental image in the viewer's mind. Notably, it employs visual motifs reminiscent of Holocaust imagery, piled bodies, illuminated shadows cast upon terrified faces. It is as though the director superimposes the memory of the Holocaust upon that of the Lebanese War, merging the suffering of the persecuted Jew with the trauma of the shocked soldier. Through this symbolic fusion, historical responsibility is replaced by emotional memory, and cinema's tools, image, music, rhythm, lighting, and symbolism, are harnessed to evoke indirect empathy for the Israeli soldier, portrayed as a human being torn between guilt and trauma. This technique is frequently employed in modern Israeli cinema to humanize soldiers, depicting them as emotionally tormented individuals whose inner turmoil conceals a deeper, institutionalized violence. It transforms the perpetrator into a victim of himself, and in doing so, absolves the system that commands him, preserving Israel's image in Western consciousness as a moral nation, even in the act of committing atrocities. Waltz with Bashir thus transforms the Sabra and Shatila massacre from an Arab tragedy into an Israeli psychological drama, erasing the presence of Palestinians and Lebanese almost entirely, reducing them to silent, faceless phantoms. Even the final scene, the only moment of actual footage showing Palestinian women wailing among the corpses, arrives only after a long introspective journey through the Israeli soldiers' reclaimed memory. As though remembering the crime itself was a peak of moral heroism for the killer, rather than an admission of a militarily sanctioned act of genocide. In that final moment, the camera enters the camp, the animated illusion collapses, and the viewer is confronted with real, documentary footage of Palestinian women mourning amid the dead. This decisive moment appears at first glance to mark the film's moral climax, yet in truth, it merely redirects the viewer's emotional focus toward the Israeli soldier's shock rather than the victim's suffering, as if the true pain were that of witnessing, not of dying. Condemnation thus transforms into sympathy, and the viewer finds themselves drawn into the soldier's existential anguish. In this way, the film stands as one of the most striking examples of contemporary Israeli cinema's use of collective denial as therapy, or what might be called directed empathy, a calculated effort to recast the image of the Israeli soldier as a wounded, conflicted being more traumatized by war than complicit in it. The soldiers are portrayed as victims of an absurd conflict they cannot comprehend. Young men in their 20s torn between their humanity and their instinct for survival, later becoming men haunted by their own nightmares. Though this portrayal appears deeply human on the surface, it conceals an essential evasion, a refusal to acknowledge moral responsibility for occupation and massacre. It turns the perpetrators into casualties of the war itself, as if they were helpless instruments, devoid of agency. Thus, the viewer finds themselves sympathizing with soldiers who weep and suffer, unwittingly drawn to pity the criminal, a revival of an old Zionist propaganda technique, the commodification of pain and tears, even if they are crocodile tears. Upon closer reflection, it becomes evident that Israeli cinema has become one of the most effective tools in advancing the Zionist project. From early on, Israel's military and political institutions understood that the camera is not merely an artistic instrument, but a subtle weapon, one capable of shaping consciousness and steering public perception, both domestically and abroad. From the early propaganda films that glorified Zionist heroism in the 1950s to more sophisticated works, we can discern a subtle transformation in Israeli cinematic discourse. Instead of directly exalting the army, the new narrative seeks to portray it as a force that suffers, one that errs, yet feels pain. It is a deliberate attempt to evoke what is known in media studies as defensive empathy, a mechanism designed to create an emotional space that prevents the audience from condemning the perpetrator. The film Waltz with Bashir marked a pivotal shift in this strategy, merging refined artistry with masterful propaganda to present an alternative narrative of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. It does not deny the massacre, but rather redefines it on a level of consciousness, transforming the killer into a tormented witness, one who can only dream, while the victim is left voiceless, relegated to the margins of the frame. Such a mechanism turns cinema from an artistic medium into a subtle ideological apparatus that reduces war to the personal memory of a soldier, transforming a collective atrocity into a private nightmare rather than a systematic tragedy. It becomes what the French sociologist Pierre Nora described as the memory of power, a form of media framing directed from above to construct a national identity that serves the state's narrative. Its ultimate aim is to produce generations who view history through an emotional lens that redefines conflict itself. This is evident in the way memory operates within the film. The director does not entirely deny the Israeli army's responsibility, yet he avoids linking it to a specific political regime or military command. Instead, he internalizes it as a collective psychological burden, replacing the question, "What have we done?" with "Why can't we remember?" This deliberate amnesia becomes the essence of Israel's manufactured memory, one that records not what truly happened, but what must be remembered to sustain the political present. In this context, Waltz with Bashir may be read as an artistic variation on the myth of the Holocaust, depicting the Sabra and Shatila massacre as a reenactment of that alleged catastrophe. Not merely as a tragic recollection, but as an ideological instrument used to rationalize every subsequent act of violence as a defensive gesture or a response to an unhealed existential trauma within the Jewish collective psyche. The director, himself the son of Holocaust survivors, intertwines two opposing images: the soldier who fought in the war and the child raised on stories of extermination. Thus, his trauma in Lebanon stems not from the horror of the massacre itself, but from the shocking realization of the resemblance between yesterday's victim and today's executioner. Yet, he does not translate this revelation into political indictment. Rather, he contains it within the film's dramatic structure as a personal anguish that purifies its bearer without assigning full moral culpability. In doing so, he transforms guilt, which should lead to confession and accountability, into a tool for reconstructing Israeli identity as an eternal victim. The Holocaust survivor, it seems, can never become an oppressor, even when armed. The Israeli soldier can never be a criminal, for deep within his consciousness, he remains the child who once hid from the Nazis. This association between the Holocaust and the Arab massacres is far from coincidental. It is a deliberate component of the Zionist political and cultural narrative that seeks to shift the burden of guilt from European history onto the modern Middle East. Through the repetition of images of loss and fear, Israel reconstructs the victim complex as a permanent moral framework, one that justifies every new act of violence. In essence, this is a narrative strategy that entrenches occupation not through territory, but through memory and representation. The film vividly demonstrates how art can be transformed from a realm of truth and beauty into a subtle instrument for reshaping consciousness and distorting memory, replacing political indictment with personal pain and justice with psychological trauma, as part of an ethical rearrangement of reality in which the executioner is recast as a human being in need of empathy. Over decades, Israel has succeeded, through cinema and directed media, in constructing what may be called emotional colonialism, the domination of global sentiment through a humanitarian discourse that conceals the ideology of occupation. While bombs fall on innocent civilians, the screens of the world display films that speak of the Israeli soldier's sorrow. Thus, cinema becomes one of the most perilous arenas of contemporary conflict, a battlefield not of bullets, but of images and symbols. And indeed, the image endures longer than the truth, and the symbol persuades more deeply than the document. Therefore, resisting this type of discourse does not mean rejecting art, but creating counter-art, art that possesses both consciousness and beauty, restoring to victims their right to narrate and interpret their own stories. Waltz with Bashir is not merely a remarkable film, it is a profoundly intelligent model of how art can serve as a moral shield for a colonial power in search of a humanitarian justification for its existence. By blending guilt with beauty, imagination with reality, it succeeds in crafting a discourse that seduces the Western viewer into empathizing with the executioner who waltzes with Bashir, a dance, in truth, upon the corpse of reality. Here lies the responsibility of the intellectual and the conscious viewer to dismantle this deception and expose its artifice, lest the land be stolen twice, once by the weapon and once by the image.